My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 29 years old. And on New Year's Day, I finally understood exactly where I stood in my own family. That morning, I walked into my parents' living room carrying a bag of specialty coffee I'd brought from Seattle and a box of fresh pastries I picked up on the way. The house was filled with the smell of cinnamon and roasted beans. Torn wrapping paper covered the floor, and the room buzzed with laughter. My mom was excitedly holding up a new kitchen gadget. My dad was already talking about a high-end grill he'd wanted for months. My sister was snapping photos of her luxury spa kit, while my niece eagerly ripped open a science experiment set. Then my name came up. I sat on the edge of the couch and waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. No one handed me anything. No one even asked if I had already opened my gift. It felt like I wasn't really there, just background noise in a scene about their perfect lives. Finally, trying to sound casual, I spoke up. So, did I miss my turn? My mom turned toward me with that familiar exhausted, irritated expression and said, "Why would we keep spending money on you? You walked away from what matters to this family. You live your own life now. Honestly, you're just a guest at this point." My sister let out a small laugh and added, "At least now you finally understand. You're not really on our level anymore." I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I stood up, placed the coffee on the table, and calmly said they would need it more than I would. Then I walked out into the freezing January air. By the time the sun set on January 1st, I was back in my Seattle apartment, staring at the financial app I had built, one that tracked every single dollar flowing through Harbor Roast, the family's coffee business. That's how the day ended. But at 8:30 the next morning, on January 2nd, a single box appeared on my parents' front porch, one that would shatter their carefully built illusion. If you want to know what was inside that box, and how the daughter they treated like she didn't exist ended up holding all the power, stay with me until the end. 5 years earlier, when I was 24, I was considered broke by most people's standards. But I was the only one in my family who truly understood how close we were to losing everything. Back then, Harbor Roast, the small coffee chain my grandparents had started in Portland, was quietly collapsing. My mother, Elaine, handled daily operations the same way she always had. My father, Richard, kept approving new equipment loans we couldn't afford. Everyone talked about loyal customers, as if good vibes could cover unpaid bills. My older sister, Vanessa, was the golden child, the face of the brand. She posted latte art on Instagram and acted like the business revolved around her image. I was the one who moved to Seattle to work in tech, the daughter who supposedly abandoned the family. I still remember the night I opened the company's financial records for the very first time. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table in Seattle, eating a cheap takeout meal, staring at a spreadsheet that made my stomach tighten. One location was behind on rent. Vendor payments were being shuffled around just to buy time, and the only real strategy my parents had was hoping the next month would somehow be better. I had just signed a solid contract as a software engineer with a fintech startup. For the first time in my life, I had actual money sitting in my bank account. And instead of celebrating, I got in my car and drove 3 hours south on I-5 to have a conversation my parents didn't want to have, one about numbers they refused to face. That night changed everything. We sat around the dining table, the same one my grandparents had bought decades earlier, and I explained it as clearly and calmly as I could. I would use my savings to cover the most urgent debt. In return, they would transfer the majority of the company's shares to me. I would rebuild the business from the inside. I told them I'd design a new point-of-sale system, connect every register in every cafe to a single cloud dashboard, and monitor every dollar moving in and out. No more handwritten notes taped to espresso machines. No more cash that mysteriously never reached the bank. My mother hated the idea of me controlling the numbers, but she hated the threat of foreclosure even more. My father signed because he believed it would only be temporary. My sister, Vanessa, signed because my mother told her to. The next morning, I drove back to Seattle and started coding. For months, my life split in two. During the day, I worked on payment systems and risk models for my employer. At night, I built the Harbor Roast dashboard, a system that pulled live data from every register, recorded every transaction, and matched sales against inventory and bank deposits. When it finally went live, I stood in the back of the flagship cafe with my laptop while my mom rang up a line of regular customers. Every card swipe, every phone tap, each one appeared on my screen in real time. It was proof, small but undeniable, that the bleeding could stop. Things stabilized, bills were paid on time, the threatening letters slowed down. My parents kept their house in the suburbs. On paper, I had saved the family business. In reality, I had only delayed the inevitable and handed them a tool powerful enough to be dangerous. What surprised me was that nothing about how they treated me really changed. At a family barbecue meant to celebrate the turnaround, my mom wrapped an arm around Vanessa in front of a group of customers and said, "She's the heart of Harbor Roast. We'd be nothing without her." Then she gestured toward me, standing off to the side with my laptop, and added, "And Natalie handles the computer stuff, whatever that is." People laughed politely. I smiled because I was used to it. I'd been the kid in the background since I was 10, the one quietly tinkering while my sister charmed the room. The difference now was that I was the kid in the background who owned most of the room and had a live feed of every sale flowing through it. For a long time, I told myself that was enough, that saving them once meant I'd done my duty. Then came the night of January 1st, 2026. Sitting alone in my Seattle apartment after walking out of that gift exchange, I opened the same dashboard I had built to rescue them and noticed something that didn't add up. Gross sales at every location were strong. Too strong. The bank deposits were unusually low, and the cash totals looked like someone had been shaving off small amounts for a long time. I scrolled backward through the data, month after month, watching the gap grow wider. That's when it hit me. My family hadn't just dismissed me. They had been using the system I built to quietly skim money, trusting that the daughter who just did computer stuff would never question it. At exactly 8:30 on the morning of January 2nd, a plain brown box appeared on my parents' front porch in Portland. I was nearly 200 miles away in my Seattle apartment, watching a progress bar slowly move across my laptop screen. The night before, after spotting the cash discrepancies in the dashboard, I stayed up exporting everything I needed from the system I had designed. Every cash transaction, every card payment, every bank deposit, every missing dollar. All of it cleanly organized into a file that told the truth far more clearly than words ever could. I copied that file, along with a lightweight, offline version of the app, onto a USB drive. I printed a few summary reports, stacked them neatly, and placed everything into the box. On top, I added a single sticky note that read, "Plug this in." No signature. No explanation. Just numbers. A same-day courier picked it up from my building's front desk and headed south while I sat there, trying to decide whether I was being petty or finally honest. Back in their kitchen, My mom was probably refilling her coffee mug. My dad scrolling through headlines on his phone. My sister checking reactions on her holiday posts. When the doorbell rang, my niece Sadie ran to the window and shouted that a package had arrived. My sister opened the door, glanced around the empty porch, and carried the box inside as if it were just another delayed gift. She ripped off the tape, flipped open the lid, and stopped cold. Inside was the USB drive. Beneath it, printed reports stamped with the Harbor Roast logo. Page after page of columns listing sales, deposits, and a steadily growing section labeled underreported. I wasn't there to see it, but I know my sister well enough to imagine her calling for our mother, her voice rising slightly with every word. My mom would have wiped her hands on a dish towel, irritated at first, until she noticed my name in the small footer at the bottom of the report. Generated by Harbor Analytics, a Natalie Brooks system. That detail was intentional. My dad would have taken the pages, flipping through them faster and faster, his face draining of color as he realized the dates stretched back years, long before that New Year's morning, when they decided I wasn't worth a $20 gift card. Somewhere in the confusion, they would have seen the line that showed how much money should have reached the bank and how much actually did. The difference wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. At some point, my mom must have grabbed her phone and tried to call me, because a notification flashed on my screen for half a second before disappearing. Blocked. Moments later, another call from my dad. Also blocked. Then a text from my sister. Are you serious right now? 3 dots appeared. Then nothing. My phone automatically filters messages from muted numbers into a quiet folder, one I never open. While they crowded around the kitchen table with those reports and that USB drive, arguing about what could be proven and what might still be hidden, I opened the same files on my laptop and scrolled slowly. I watched the figures on my screen the way someone watches an old injury finally heal. For years, they had dismissed me, told anyone who would listen that I was just the kid who messed around with computers while they handled the real work. Now every shortcut they'd taken, and every dollar they'd quietly pulled aside was laid out in a format built for bankers, auditors, and tax authorities to understand without emotion. I still hadn't decided who, exactly, I would show it to when I saved the file and closed my laptop. But one thing was suddenly crystal clear. For the first time in my life, my family needed something from me far more than I needed anything from them. The next afternoon, my sister Vanessa showed up at my Seattle apartment like nothing had happened, like we were just 2 normal siblings meeting for coffee after the holidays. I watched her through the peephole for a moment. She stood in the hallway in an expensive coat, phone in one hand, reusable coffee cup in the other. She looked more like an influencer on a brand deal than someone whose entire business had just been taken apart line by line. When I opened the door, she smiled too brightly. "Natalie, can we talk?" My first instinct was to close the door again. Instead, I stepped aside and let her in. She wandered slowly around my living room, commenting on the view, the framed hackathon badge on the wall, the second monitor on my desk, like she was seeing proof for the first time that my life was real. Then she set her cup down and dropped the performance. "Mom is losing it," she said. "Dad too." Her voice had that tight edge she gets when she's scared, but trying to stay in control. "They found your name on the reports. They know it came from you." I leaned against the counter and waited. She started talking faster. "We thought you just helped with the loans. That's it. We didn't know you actually owned most of the company, or that you had some kind of backdoor access to everything." "That's not how this works," I said calmly. You all sat at the table. You signed the paperwork. You knew exactly what I was offering and what I was asking for. She waved it off like it was an unimportant detail. They're saying this is going to create a massive tax problem, that you blew everything up over nothing, over a bad holiday. Natalie. My chest tightened. Nothing. A bad holiday. I saw it again, my mother looking straight through me on New Year's Day while everyone else opened gifts, and something inside me finally clicked into place. Vanessa must have seen it on my face, because she changed tactics. Look, she said quietly, lowering her voice. You know how things actually run. Cash is just easier sometimes. People have done it this way forever. Then she paused. And Saudi loves her school. She loves her friends. If this gets any worse, we could lose the house, the cafes, everything. She looked straight at me. Do you really want to be the reason she has to pack up her room and say goodbye to her whole life? I almost laughed because it was so predictable. When we were kids, our mom used the same move every time. Wrap everything in guilt, family, and tradition until you couldn't tell where your feelings ended and hers began. I thought about Saudi, her messy ponytail, her science kits, how she had nothing to do with any of this. For a moment, my resolve wavered. Then I remembered the numbers. Years of unreported cash. Years of tax filings signed with my name listed as an officer, while money was quietly siphoned from the business I had saved. You're not putting this on a 9-year-old, I said quietly. You, Mom, and Dad made these choices, not her. She shook her head like I was being unreasonable. You changed, Natalie. You left. You chose tech and strangers over your own family. And now you're punishing us because we didn't throw you a celebration every time you came home. There it was. I had walked away from the only thing that mattered. I was selfish, ungrateful. I supposedly owed them loyalty forever, just because we shared a last name. Her words dragged me back to a winter morning when I was 15, standing in the back of the original Harbor Roast, a battered laptop balanced on a milk crate. I'd stayed up all night teaching myself how to build a simple ordering page. I was proud of it, just a small form that could send drink choices straight to the barista. When I showed it to my mom, she laughed softly and told me to put it away so I wouldn't scare off the regulars. People come here to talk to us, not to a screen, she said, loud enough for the entire line to hear. Then she called Vanessa out front and had her practice steaming milk and chatting with customers, while I stood in the back pretending to focus on homework. I didn't realize it then, but that moment set the pattern for the next 10 years. She was the face. I was the background. And now the background had receipts. Back in my apartment, I straightened my posture and looked my sister directly in the eye. I'm not doing this to you, I said evenly. I'm done protecting decisions I didn't make. If there's nothing to hide, then the numbers will line up. She opened her mouth, closed it, then grabbed her cup. This isn't you, she muttered as she headed for the door. You used to be the one person I could count on to put family first. I let the words hang for a moment before replying. Maybe putting family first is how I ended up in this mess. After she left, the silence in my apartment felt heavier than it had the night before. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up everything I'd exported: reports, transaction logs, email threads where my parents casually mentioned pulling a little extra cash this week. My name appeared on corporate filings that made me legally responsible if anything went wrong. I dialed the number of a Seattle business attorney. A coworker had recommended months earlier during a half-joking conversation about worst-case scenarios. This time, it wasn't a joke. I explained who I was, what I'd built, what I'd discovered. Then I asked the question I'd been avoiding since the first discrepancy appeared. If I know there's tax fraud happening in a company where my name is on the paperwork, and I stay quiet, does that make me complicit? She didn't soften it. It doesn't look good, she said. And if this blows up later, they will absolutely try to make you the fall guy. She walked me through my options, including one I'd heard of but never seriously considered, the IRS whistleblower program. I spent the rest of the day reading everything I could find. I cross-checked requirements against my data. I made sure I hadn't crossed any privacy or access boundaries. I had admin credentials. I built the system. Those reports were mine to access. By the time the sun set over Seattle again, I had written a detailed statement, attached supporting files, and completed the online submission. Not as a bitter daughter, as a majority shareholder who no longer wanted her name tied to a lie. Clicking submit didn't feel dramatic. There was no rush, no cinematic moment. It felt like stepping out of a burning house I'd been told to pretend was fine. Maybe real family would have noticed I was the one choking on the smoke. Several months later, the first white envelope from the Internal Revenue Service arrived in my parents' mailbox. Everything that had been whispered around their kitchen table suddenly carried an official letterhead. I didn't see their faces when they opened it, but I heard about the panic secondhand from a cousin who worked part-time at one of the cafes. He texted me that my mom went quiet in the middle of a rush, walked into the back room with the letter, and came out with eyes so red even the regulars noticed. The notice itself wasn't dramatic. It was a standard audit letter, requesting a closer look at several years of returns for a small business that looked far more profitable on paper than in its bank accounts. For a normal company, it would have been stressful but manageable. For Harbor Roast, with years of hidden cash and a majority owner who had already filed a whistleblower report, it was a slow-burning fuse leading somewhere much worse. My parents reacted exactly the way I expected. They hired a local tax lawyer, printed their own version of the numbers, and tried to construct a story where the missing deposits were nothing more than harmless mistakes. They talked about informal cash bonuses, tips handled outside the system, small favors for employees that never officially hit payroll. From what I could tell, the strategy was simple. Blame sloppy bookkeeping. Lean hard on the family business narrative. Hope the IRS would settle for a warning and move on. My name entered the conversation the moment the attorney asked who had designed their system. That was when this stopped being a private family problem and became something I couldn't step away from. One morning in Seattle, in between meetings at my fintech job, I got a call from an IRS agent. She introduced herself, confirmed that I was the majority shareholder and the architect of the point-of-sale system, and asked if I'd be willing to answer questions about how it worked. I closed my office door, sat down, and said yes. We scheduled a video call. A week later, I found myself staring at a split screen with the three people who had shaped my entire childhood. My parents were seated at the dining room table in Portland. My sister sat beside them. The same chandelier hung overhead, the one that had witnessed every Christmas, every birthday, every major argument we'd ever had. On the other side of the call were the IRS agent, her supervisor, and the tax attorney my parents had hired. I sat alone in a neutral conference room at my office, glass walls behind me. I pushed my laptop slightly farther back than usual so I wouldn't have to look too closely at my own reflection. The agent began with standard questions. How long had I been a shareholder? When did I deploy the point-of-sale system? What level of access did I have to the data? I answered carefully and truthfully. I explained that each register sends transactions to a centralized database in real time. Every sale is logged with a timestamp, payment type, and amount. The system automatically produces daily reconciliation reports comparing total sales to bank deposits. When the attorney tried to suggest that syncing issues might explain the gaps, or that logs could be incomplete, I asked permission to share my screen. Using demo data, I pulled up a sanitized version of the dashboard and walked them through how it worked. I showed the transaction trail, the reconciliation view, and the error logs that flag any failed data transfer. The agent watched silently, taking notes. My parents stared at the screen like they were seeing what I'd built for the first time. Once the mechanics were clear, the questions changed. Had I ever discussed discrepancies between reported income and system data? Had anyone ever asked me to adjust numbers? I explained that I'd noticed small warning signs in earlier years and raised them cautiously, only to have them brushed off with jokes about cash being hard to track. I stated clearly that I had never altered the data. I had never edited logs or deleted transactions. The system was designed to prevent silent changes without a permanent audit trail. That's when my mother broke down. She dabbed at her eyes without smearing her makeup and said into the camera, "We're just a family trying to keep a small business alive. We're not a big corporation. Maybe we made mistakes, but we're not criminals." My dad followed, talking about the pressure of payroll, rising rent, and supply costs, about how sometimes you take cash because you don't know when the next crisis is coming. My sister tried a different angle, suggesting the problem was me, that I'd built something too complex, that the system was confusing, an app none of them truly understood. She hinted that some of the discrepancies could be my responsibility, that maybe I had set something up incorrectly, or passed incomplete information to their accountant without explaining it properly. I stayed quiet and let them talk. When they finally paused, the attorney glanced in my direction, giving a subtle nod, asking whether I wanted to respond. I took a slow breath, kept my voice steady, and said, "The system doesn't lose cash, people do." I explained that the underreported amounts weren't random mistakes. They followed a consistent pattern, one that always benefited the same individuals. The agent asked whether I could provide exported files to support my claim. I told her I already had. They should be attached to the whistleblower submission filed months ago under my name. The silence that followed was the longest stretch of quiet I could remember between my parents and me. The attorney cleared his throat, finally realizing I wasn't there to help clean up their narrative. I was there to separate myself from it. The weeks that followed blurred together, endless paperwork and a low, constant tension. The IRS requested bank statements, vendor invoices, payroll records, and years' worth of receipts. They cross-checked my exports against actual deposits. Every time a gap surfaced, another letter went out. And every time a letter arrived, my parents called or texted, until I muted, then blocked another number. While all of this was unfolding, my life in Seattle took an unexpected upward turn. My manager pulled me aside one afternoon and told me a research paper I'd co-written on small business fraud detection had been accepted at a fintech conference in San Francisco. They wanted me to present a case study, one I had anonymized using Harbor Roast data, stripped of family names and personal history. I booked the flight and wrote a talk about how transparent technology can protect both owners and employees. I tried not to dwell on the irony of building professional success from the collapse of my own family's illusion. The day I stood on stage in a hotel ballroom explaining to a room full of founders how underreported cash can hide in plain sight, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from my cousin in Portland. I didn't listen to it until late that night. When I did, his voice was unsteady. The IRS had just wrapped a key meeting with my parents and their attorney. The words fraud and penalties had been used more than once. At that point, it wasn't about whether consequences were coming. It was about how severe they would be and how much of the blame they'd try to push onto me. By the time the hammer finally fell, it was late summer. The kind of sticky Portland heat that makes everything feel heavier than it should. I was at my desk in Seattle when the email arrived from the IRS agent. The audit was complete. The underreported cash wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. It was a pattern, and it would be treated as one. A few days later, my cousin sent me a photo of a thick envelope sitting on my parents' kitchen table. Inside was the official determination. Years of unpaid back taxes, civil penalties, and interest that had been quietly accumulating while they pretended everything was fine. It was more than Harbor Roast could survive, even in a strong year. And this wasn't a strong year. Customers had been drifting away for months, unsettled by rumors and the tension that hung behind the counter. My parents tried to hold things together at first. They called emergency family meetings, ones I was never invited to. They spoke to banks about restructuring loans, to landlords about rent relief, to anyone willing to listen about being unfairly targeted. None of it changed the math. Within weeks, the for sale signs started appearing. First, the smallest cafe, the cozy one near the university where I used to do my homework as a kid. Then the downtown flagship, the one my mom always called her second living room. They sold equipment at a discount, furniture for less than it was worth, anything to scrape together enough cash to keep the penalties from swallowing them whole. The house came next. The big craftsman in the suburbs that had hosted every Thanksgiving and birthday. The place I'd driven away from on New Year's Day, coffee untouched, hands shaking. They packed decades of family photos into cardboard boxes and moved into a small rental apartment on the far side of town, somewhere cheaper, somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere no one would look at them the way they used to. The damage didn't stop with money. My dad started seeing a cardiologist after his blood pressure spiked so badly during one appointment that the nurse refused to let him leave without additional tests. My mom stopped posting cheerful updates from behind the counter because there was no counter left that belonged to her. The regulars she once greeted by name slowly drifted to other cafes. The women she used to brag with about running a successful family business stopped inviting her to brunch. Vanessa tried to ride out the fallout online. She shifted her content away from the family brand toward vague lifestyle posts, neutral photos, inspirational captions. But sponsors quietly backed away once they realized the charming coffee empire behind her image had turned into a cautionary tale. The cracks in her marriage to Evan, always there beneath the surface, split wide open once the financial pressure hit. He resented being pulled into a disaster he hadn't created. She resented that he wouldn't pretend everything would magically work itself out. Within months, they were separated. Not long after, divorced. Sadi went from a large bedroom in a quiet school district to a smaller apartment and a new school where no one recognized her last name. Somewhere in the middle of all that, my parents made one last attempt to turn me into the villain. One night, my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I answered without thinking. I heard my mother's voice, before the call even fully connected. "You did this," she said. Her voice was raw, like she'd been crying for hours. "You tore this family apart over numbers on a screen and a hurt feeling from a holiday. We lost everything because you couldn't let it go." I didn't interrupt. I let her talk. I let my dad take the phone and say it too, in his quieter way, telling me about friends who no longer called, about former employees who had moved on. At the end of it, he said, "They never would have looked this closely if you hadn't pointed them at us. You turned in your own parents. That has to mean something to you." "It does," I said. "It means I'm not willing to take the fall for decisions I didn't make. You signed my name on those returns. You used my system to hide cash and assumed I'd stay silent because we share DNA. That was your gamble," I added. "And it didn't work." There was more arguing, more guilt, more appeals to tradition and loyalty. None of it changed the outcome. The IRS decision stood. Harbor roast was finished. When the call finally disconnected, I sat there staring at my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not victory. Not happiness. Just a clean, sharp relief. I was out. Shortly after the last cafe sold, I received the paperwork to finalize the transfer of my remaining shares to the buyer, a regional coffee group that had purchased the brand name and a handful of the former locations. I signed everything digitally, watched my ownership drop to zero, and saw the wire transfer land in my account a few days later. It wasn't a fortune, especially after debts and penalties were settled. But it was enough. Enough for a down payment on a small house near the river in Portland. A place with large windows and a spare room I could turn into an office. Enough to strengthen the savings I had started once I accepted that family was not a safety net I could rely on. I moved back to Oregon on my own terms. Not to my parents' couch. Not under the shadow of the old harbor roast sign. I moved to a quiet street where no one knew me as the daughter who walked away from the family business. I brought my monitors, my worn-out hoodie, and the same laptop I had used to build the system that changed everything. I set my desk facing the water and opened a blank document titled Next. Officially, I was still a senior engineer at my fintech company. Unofficially, I had begun sketching out plans for my own product, a tool designed to help small business owners catch the exact kind of fraud and carelessness my parents had justified as survival. There was a certain balance to it. They had used my skills to cheat the system. I was going to use those same skills to help other people keep their books honest. Months later, as fall returned to the Pacific Northwest, I passed one of the old harbor roast locations on my way to meet a friend. The sign was different. The menu redesigned. The baristas were strangers. No one recognized me. No one knew my last name had once been painted on the windows. I paused for a moment, watching customers line up for their drinks, and felt an unexpected mix of grief and gratitude. The place that had shaped my childhood was gone. The version of me that needed their approval had gone with it. The people who hurt me had paid a price I didn't need to collect in person. I turned away and kept walking, toward a life that finally felt like it belonged to me. The first morning I woke up in my small house by the river, light filtered in softly through the blinds. For a brief moment, I forgot everything that had happened. There was no smell of espresso roasting downstairs. No clatter of cups. No distant sound of my mother calling out orders in that bright, performative voice she saved for customers. Just quiet. My own coffee mug. My own kitchen. My own name on the lease. I made a pour-over using beans from a local roaster that had nothing to do with my family, carried it into my office, and opened my laptop. The Harbor Roast dashboard was gone from my bookmarks. In its place was a new project folder, the one I'd started the night I signed my shares away. A tool for small business owners who wanted transparency instead of convenient blind spots. A system designed to protect decent people from the exact shortcuts my parents had convinced themselves were normal. Building it was unexpectedly healing. Every line of code felt like undoing something that had been twisted before. Instead of hiding cash, this system highlighted risk patterns. Instead of making it easy for owners to skim, it made it easier for employees to see when something didn't add up. I started attending local meetups. I talked with other founders. I listened to stories from baristas and bookkeepers who had watched bosses play games with numbers and felt powerless to stop it. I eventually understood that my family wasn't unique. The only unusual thing was that someone on the inside had both the skills and the resolve to say, "This is wrong, and I'm not carrying it for you." Updates about my parents and Vanessa reached me slowly after that. I heard my mom had taken a part-time job at a mid-sized cafe across town. Early mornings, clocking in and out like everyone else. She stopped posting about being the heart of any brand. Now she just made drinks and wiped counters. My dad rented a small apartment near the freeway, cheap, anonymous, easy to disappear into. He kept his medical appointments, took his medication, and spent most days watching sports with the volume turned too high. The friends who used to crowd the backyard for barbecues didn't come by anymore. At first there were a few texts, then silence. Vanessa bounced between content gigs, trying to rebuild her online presence without the Harbor Roast backdrop. She still smiled into the camera, still talked about cozy mornings and hustle culture. But the comment sections were quieter. The glossy story of a thriving family business had cracked, and no filter could repair it. Sadi started over at a new school in a different district. I saw a photo once, forwarded to me by accident. Her backpack looked almost as big as she was. Her hand was wrapped in her mother's, her face turned slightly away from the camera. She looked small, and braver than she ever should have had to be. That night, I opened a separate savings account in her name, one she doesn't know exists yet. I set up an automatic transfer from every paycheck. It isn't some dramatic gesture. It's a quiet promise to myself that if she ever wants an education, an exit, or simply a choice not wrapped in guilt or obligation, something will be waiting for her, something not tied to anyone else's secrets. People sometimes ask if I regret what I did. They almost always phrase it the same way. Was it worth it? Did it feel good to watch them lose everything? The honest answer is complicated. It didn't feel good watching my parents' faces collapse on a grainy video call. It didn't feel good hearing the strain in my sister's voice when she realized there was no easy escape. It didn't feel good knowing a 9-year-old had to pack up her room because the adults in her life chose shortcuts over integrity. What did feel right was stepping out of a role I was never meant to carry. Ever felt like your family sees you as invisible until you suddenly hold all the cards? Here, what happened when I stopped being the convenient scapegoat and finally chose myself? I grew up thinking I had to absorb every bad decision, patch every hole, and silently carry the weight of choices I didn't make, because that was what family meant. It took an audit and an investigation, with my name on the paperwork, to understand the truth. Family without respect is just shared history. What I did wasn't revenge in the cartoon sense. I didn't slash tires, scream in parking lots, or try to ruin anyone's life. I simply told the truth to the only people who could act on it, and refused to lie just because we shared a last name. That was my revenge. I chose myself. I chose not to be the quiet, convenient scapegoat anymore. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not that you should turn your parents in at the first sign of trouble. It's that loving someone doesn't mean covering up the damage they cause. It's that your skills, even the ones your family rolls their eyes at, can have power far beyond their approval. And it's that protecting your own future isn't betrayal, when the alternative is being dragged down with someone else's mistakes. These days, my life is small in a way that finally feels peaceful. I write code. I walk by the river. I grab coffee with friends who see me as a person, not a problem to fix or a resource to exploit. Sometimes I pass one of the old harbor roast locations and feel a flicker of grief. What might have been if honesty had been chosen? But the feeling passes. The relief stays. I didn't ruin their lives. I just stopped helping them hide the ways they were ruining themselves. If you've ever been the odd one out in your family, the disappointing child, the one they only call when something needs fixing, I hope my story reminds you that you are allowed to draw a line. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to choose a life where you aren't paying interest on someone else's mistakes. And if you were in my shoes, your name on those documents, your work twisted into a weapon, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace, or would you have walked away like I did? Comment below and let me know. This is Natalie Brooks, and thanks for watching. If you found this story powerful, hit like, share with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories about taking control of your life.